IDA cultural bias. Psychologists seek universality, but bias may be inevitable. Many critics argue that although psychology may claim to have unearthed truths about people all over the world, universality, in reality, findings from studies only apply to the particular groups of people who were studied, i.e., show cultural bias. Researchers have wrongly assumed findings from studies in Western cultures can be applied all over the world. For example, studies of conformity by Ash and obedience by Milgram revealed very different results when they were replicated in parts of the world outside the US. If the norm or standard for a particular behavior is just from only one standpoint of one particular culture, then any cultural differences in behavior would inevitably be seen as abnormal, inferior, or unusual. Ethnocentrism is the belief in the superiority of one's cultural group, and it results in a view that other behaviors are deficient. In psychology, this may occur when one behavior that doesn't conform to the usually Western model is the is doesn't conform to the usually Western model is somehow deficient or undeveloped. One notable example of ethnocentrism research, ethnocentric research, is The Strange Situation by Ainsworth. Ainsworth has been criticized as reflecting only the norms and values of American culture in attachment research. She identified the key defining variable of attachment type as a child's experience of anxiety and separation. She suggested that the ideal or secure attachment was the infant showing moderate stress when left alone with the mother figure, and this led to the misinterpretation of child rearing practices in other countries that deviated from the US norm. For example, German mothers were seen as cold and rejecting. Respecting cultural relativism helps to avoid cultural bias. The facts and things that psychologists may discover only may make sense from the perspective of the culture within they were discovered. And being able to recognize this as one way of avoiding cultural bias in research. Ethic and emic approaches are universal or culture specific, respectively. Berry argues that an ethic approach looks at behavior from outside a given culture and identifies behaviors that are universal. An emic culture functions from within certain cultures and identifies behaviors that are specific to that culture. So, ethic is universally specific, emic is culturally specific. Ainsworth's research illustrates an imposed ethic. AA3. One limitation is the distinction between individualism and collectivism. So, psychologists have often referred to culture in the context of individualism versus collectivism. Individualist cultures, for example, US, valued the individual and independence. Collectivist culture, for example, India, valued the group and interdependence. Critics argue that this is a lazy and simplistic distinction that no longer applies. Research found 14 out of 15 studies comparing the US to Japan found no evidence of a distinction between the two types of culture, and this could suggest that this form of bias, individualist versus collectivist, is less of an issue than it previously was. This reduces the validity of individualism and collectivism as a measure of cultural bias. One strength is the recognition of both cultural relativism and universals. The imposed ethic shows the culturally specific nature of psychology. However, we shouldn't assume that all psychology is culturally relative and that there is no such thing as universal human behavior. Researchers suggest that basic facial expressions are the same universally for humans and animals. Some features of human attachment, such as social releases, imitation, interaction, or synchrony, are universal. A full understanding of human behavior requires the study of both universals and variation among individuals and groups. Another limitation is cross-cultural research is prone to demand characteristics. When conducting research in Western culture, the participants' familiarity with general aims and objectives of scientific inquiry is assumed. In cultures without historical experience of research, local populations may be more affected by demand characteristics than Western participants, and this is a particular form of cultural bias where unfamiliarity with research of tradition threatens the validity of the outcome.